Let's test cheap versus expensive shin pads. Starting with a comfortability check, we can see that cheap has more surface area. This correlates with our slippage test, where expensive moves around more. Moving on to a wine glass break test, then we can see that expensive breaks and cheap doesn't. Again confirming this, where cheap feels a lot less painful when struck by a hammer. And finally we can see cheap transfers less energy, so cheap wins. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive football gloves. Starting with a watermelon pickup test, this time cheap does better. Onto our bodyweight grip hang test, and we can see that cheap moves around a bit more than expensive. Both perform well on a medicine ball drop test. On our breathability test, we can see that cheap does a much better job. And this follows on with our dexterity test, where again cheap does better. And finally confirming cheap has a higher surface grip, so cheap wins. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive Astros. Starting with the grip test, we can see that cheap holds on longer. Moving on to our kick test, and cheap seems to have more spring to it. Expensive performs slightly better on a run test, having a bit more feel to it, but we can see that it has a slightly worse stopping distance than cheap. And finally we can see cheap is better ventilated than expensive, so cheap wins. Very cool.